Oakland, 1964. The room wasn't built for history. Low ceiling, fluorescent light that hummed just enough to be noticed. People stood close, not because they wanted to, but because there wasn't space not to. Shoes stopped shifting. Conversations thinned out. Someone near the back crossed their arms and didn't uncross them again. Bruce Lee didn't arrive like someone expecting a test. He came in the way people do when they think the matter is already settled. Light on his feet, calm in the shoulders. He smiled at a few faces he recognized. Some smiled back. Some didn't. This wasn't a stage. No tickets. No applause waiting at the end. The air felt conditional, like everyone understood there were rules they hadn't been told yet. A few older men watched him carefully, not with hostility, something cooler than that. Measurement. Ownership. Lee loosened his jacket and set it aside. That small movement drew more attention than it should have. The room went quieter, not dramatically, just enough that breathing became noticeable. Someone cleared their throat and immediately seemed embarrassed by it. Nobody announced what was at stake. Nobody had to. There was an understanding moving between the walls. This wasn't about winning. It was about permission. About whether the future he was building was allowed to exist the way he imagined it. And right then, before anything happened, before anyone moved toward anyone else, you could feel it. Whatever occurred in this room would not stay here. Bruce Lee stood with his back near the wall, not leaning on it, just close enough to feel where the room ended. He didn't scan faces the way newcomers do. His eyes moved like he already knew who would be there. People knew him too, not from posters, not from television, from rooms like this, from word passed hand to hand, from demonstrations that left people quiet afterward, from the way students repeated his drills without fully understanding why they worked, from stories that always ended the same way. I didn't expect that. He had trained across styles others kept separate. He taught publicly when teaching was supposed to stay private. That alone was enough to make some men uneasy. But he wasn't loud about it. He didn't announce change. He behaved as if it had already happened. A few instructors nodded when they saw him. Small gestures, respectful but measured. Others watched without expression, arms folded, weight settled into their heels. Those men didn't move much. They didn't have to. Lee's authority didn't come from claiming mastery. It came from how people adjusted themselves around him. When he stretched, conversations softened. When he stopped, someone in the front row straightened their back without realizing it. He rolled his shoulders once slowly. The movement was practical, almost dismissible. Still, eyes followed it. His body carried familiarity with effort, the kind that doesn't tense before action. It waits. There was no formal introduction. None was needed. Everyone there knew why he had been called in, even if no one had said it aloud. This was not a challenge issued with hostility. It was closer to an inspection. An older man near the center whispered something to the person beside him. The whisper didn't travel far, but its effect did. A few heads turned toward Lee, then away again, as if looking too long might signal allegiance. Lee noticed. He always noticed. He didn't react. That restraint mattered. In rooms like this, restraint was read as confidence or defiance, depending on who was watching. He seemed comfortable letting others decide which. He removed his watch and placed it carefully on a chair. That simple act carried more intention than any speech. Someone exhaled through their nose, sharp and quick, then went still again. This was the point where many men would have spoken, explained their background, clarified their intentions. Lee didn't. Words here were slippery. They could be bent, quoted, misremembered. Movement was cleaner. He clasped his hands loosely, then let them fall to his sides. Not ready, just available. What pressed against him wasn't anger. It was expectation, the expectation that he would conform, or at least acknowledge the boundaries that had been drawn long before he arrived. That he would recognize who had permission to teach and who did not. Lee had heard the warnings before. He had smiled through them. He had kept teaching anyway. Now those warnings had condensed into a room full of people and a single, unspoken condition. Someone cleared their throat, louder this time. A signal, maybe. Or nerves. Lee stepped forward, not toward anyone in particular, just forward enough that the space between him and the center of the room disappeared. The floor creaked under his weight and then settled. He looked calm. Not performative calm, the kind that comes from having already accepted the possible outcomes. Around him, the room tightened. Not with aggression, with attention. Whatever happened next would not be dismissed as rumor. No one outlined the terms. They emerged instead through small decisions: who stood where, who remained seated, who avoided Bruce Lee's eyes as if that alone might be read as consent. This wasn't a place where rules were written down. They were inherited, passed quietly from teacher to student, from closed rooms to narrower ones. Tradition here didn't shout. It pressed. A man near the center finally shifted his weight forward. He wasn't introduced, but his presence carried recognition. Others angled their bodies slightly toward him, the way people do when they agree, even before anything is said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The expectation was simple, though it had never been phrased that way. Knowledge stayed within lines. Culture stayed protected. Influence did not spread without approval. Lee listened. He always did. His face remained neutral, but his jaw set just enough to show he understood the implication beneath the words. This wasn't about safety or respect. It was about control. Someone mentioned tradition. Another spoke of responsibility. The phrases landed softly, rehearsed enough to sound reasonable. Around the edges of the room, a few younger students shifted, uncomfortable but silent. They had learned early when silence was required. Lee nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. That gesture alone unsettled a few people. It suggested he wasn't here to argue the framework. He was here to test it. The unspoken condition hovered between them now, heavy but fragile. Prove yourself or step back. Not defeat. Compliance. Lee didn't correct anyone. Didn't defend his teaching. Didn't mention how long he had trained, or how many had trusted him with their bodies and time. Those facts existed, but they weren't currency in this exchange. What mattered was whether he would yield. The room waited for him to speak. He didn't. Instead, he took a small step to the side, clearing space at the center. An invitation without words, the kind that couldn't be misunderstood. A few people exchanged looks. This wasn't the direction they expected things to go. One man hesitated before moving. That hesitation registered. It rippled outward, subtle but real. In rooms like this, delay could feel like doubt. Someone else leaned in, as if to see better. Though nothing had happened yet. Lee's posture changed, not dramatically, just enough that his balance shifted forward, weight on the balls of his feet. He wasn't coiled. He was present. The difference mattered. There was a long pause, longer than anyone planned. Silence thickened, not empty, but full of interpretation. Every person in the room was doing the same calculation. If this went wrong, who would be blamed? A chair scraped faintly as someone adjusted. The sound felt louder than it was. Finally, the man at the center nodded once. Not permission. More like acceptance of inevitability. Whatever boundaries existed had reached their limit. Lee met his eyes. No challenge there, just clarity. The space between them felt narrower now, though neither had moved closer. Breath slowed. Shoulders settled. Even the light seemed harsher, exposing rather than illuminating. This was no longer a conversation about tradition. It had become a moment where tradition would have to respond. No signal marked the beginning. No bow, no formal stance. The shift happened the way storms do. First the pressure change, then motion. Bruce Lee stepped in lightly, not fast enough to impress, not slow enough to invite interruption. His hands came up, relaxed, fingers loose. Across from him, the other man adjusted his footing. The movement, instinctive. He had done this many times before. So had Lee. The room leaned forward without realizing it. What followed didn't resemble the demonstration some had expected. There was no flourish, no declaration of style, just two bodies reading each other, searching for commitment. Lee's eyes stayed quiet. His shoulders barely moved. Then a sudden advance. Not explosive. Precise. Lee closed distance with a directness that startled a few people near the edge. It wasn't the speed that caught attention. It was the lack of hesitation, as if the decision had been made long before this room existed. The other man reacted, shifting back to create space. His heel slid a fraction on the floor. It wasn't dramatic, but it was visible. Someone inhaled sharply, then stopped themselves. Lee pressed forward again, hands alive now, not striking but occupying. He didn't chase power. He chased position. The room began to register something unfamiliar. This wasn't a contest unfolding the way it usually did. A brief clash of movement. Arms met. Weight shifted. For a moment, everything compressed into a narrow space between them. The air felt thinner there. Then it happened. The other man broke rhythm just briefly. A forced reset, small but undeniable. He stepped back to regain balance, eyes widening for a fraction of a second before control returned. That was enough, not to declare victory, but to change the room. Lee didn't follow. He stopped where he was, feet planted, breath steady. That choice carried weight. It said, "I don't need to prove more." Silence hit harder than the movement had. No one spoke. A few people glanced at each other, then away, as if checking whether what they saw had really happened. The man opposite Lee straightened, face composed again, but something had shifted behind the eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Sometimes those look the same. Lee lowered his hands, not in dismissal, in completion. The light hummed. Someone near the wall swallowed audibly. The room had expected a clear ending. Someone stopped. Someone yielded. Instead, it was left with ambiguity, and that unsettled people more than defeat would have. No one clapped. That would have felt wrong. Lee stepped back, giving space again. His breathing remained calm, almost boring in its steadiness. He reached for his jacket but didn't put it on yet. This hadn't been about dominance or humiliation. It had been about whether what he carried could stand in this room without permission. Judging by the faces around him, the answer was complicated. No one rushed to fill the silence. That was the first thing that felt different. In most rooms, after movement stops, people hurried toward explanations, toward laughter, toward something that restores order. Here, nothing rushed in. The pause held. Bruce Lee stood where he had stopped, shoulders loose, gaze unfixed. He wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't looking away either. His stillness felt intentional, as if he understood that whatever followed mattered more than what had just happened. The man across from him adjusted his stance, then didn't. He opened his mouth slightly, closed it again. The gesture was small, but a few people noticed. They always notice. Someone at the back shifted their weight from one foot to the other. The floor creaked again. It sounded almost apologetic. This was the moment where authority usually reasserted itself. A word from the right person could have sealed the interpretation, framed what everyone had seen in safer language. But no one spoke. Perhaps no one wanted to be responsible for naming it. Lee finally reached for his jacket and slid it on, slow and unhurried. That action, more than the movement before, signaled finality. A few heads nodded without meaning to. Others stiffened. The older men near the center exchanged brief looks. Not anger. Not agreement. Calculation. They had come prepared to enforce a line. They hadn't prepared to the line to blur without being crossed. Lee's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved now, taking in the room as if seeing it anew. Some faces met his gaze, others dropped theirs. A young student near the edge looked openly stunned, hands clenched at his sides, as if holding back a question he knew better than to ask. Someone cleared their throat again. This time, no one reacted. The man who had spoken earlier finally nodded, once more. It wasn't approval. It wasn't dismissal. It was acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. Lee inclined his head in return. Respectful. Neutral. Enough. There was a sense, quiet but real, that the conversation had ended without concluding. No ruling had been issued, no condition formally stated. And yet everyone felt the shift. The air seemed lighter, but not relieved. More like uncertain. Lee moved toward the door. No one blocked his path. That absence mattered. As he passed, a few people stepped aside instinctively, creating space where none had existed before. At the threshold he paused, not for effect, just long enough to adjust the sleeve of his jacket. The smallness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the weight of what lingered behind him. When the door closed, the room remained still. Only then did people begin to speak, softly at first. Questions without punctuation, statements that trailed off. No one laughed. No one claimed certainty. What had happened was already escaping the room, carried in posture, in silence, in the way people avoided certain eyes. And for those who had been watching closely, the pause lingered longest of all. People didn't leave all at once. That was unusual. Normally, the end of a confrontation creates release movement, chatter, the scraping of chairs. Here, bodies stayed where they were, as if standing up too quickly might disturb something still settling. A few men spoke in low tones. Not arguments, not praise, just short exchanges that circled without landing. Words like interesting and unexpected surfaced, then disappeared again. No one said Lee's name right away. The man who had faced him sat down slowly. He wiped his hands on his trousers, then folded them together, staring at nothing in particular. Someone approached him as if to ask a question, then stopped halfway and thought better of it. Across the room, younger students clustered near the wall, whispering. Their voices were careful, but their eyes were alive. What they had seen didn't fit neatly into what they had been taught, and that unsettled them more than fear ever could. A door opened briefly, letting in hallway noise louder from somewhere else. Footsteps passing by. It felt out of place, almost intrusive. The door closed again, and the room returned to its muted state. No one declared a winner. That silence carried its own verdict. In the days that followed, the story traveled unevenly, not as a clean account, but as fragments. He didn't back down. It ended faster than expected. There was a moment. Did you hear about the moment? Each retelling emphasized something different, depending on who was speaking and what they stood to lose. Some instructors grew cautious. They softened their warnings, chose their words more carefully. Others doubled down, drawing lines with greater clarity, as if boldness might reassert control. Both reactions pointed to the same truth. The ground had shifted. Lee returned to teaching as he always had. No announcement. No explanation. Students noticed subtle changes, not in his technique, but in how people spoke about him. Invitations came more slowly, but they came. So did resistance, quieter now. He didn't respond to either with speeches, he responded by showing up. For those who had been in the room, the memory stayed physical. A breath held too long. A step back taken without thinking, the way silence had settled after movement stopped. Months later, when arguments flared about what should or shouldn't be taught, someone would pause mid-sentence, as if remembering something they hadn't planned to remember. The conversation would shift, or end. Nothing about that day looked like a turning point while it was happening. There were no headlines, no public reckoning, but people walked a little differently afterward. They left more space than before. Time smoothed the sharp edges, but it didn't erase them. The Oakland room faded into memory, repurposed, repainted, its walls forgetting what they once held. But the moment itself didn't disappear. It resurfaced in decisions, in hesitations, in the way certain doors were left half open instead of closed. Bruce Lee's career didn't change overnight. That's not how things move when tradition is involved. What changed was quieter. Resistance learned to speak in softer tones. Authority stopped assuming it would go untested. Some who had been there never mentioned it again. Silence was their way of containing what they couldn't reconcile. Others told the story carefully, editing themselves mid-sentence, aware that the telling carried consequences. Lee continued forward, not dragging the past behind him. He refined. He questioned. He discarded what didn't serve him. The permission he had been asked to seek was never requested again, not because it was granted, but because it no longer seemed necessary. Years later, people argued about that day, about what really happened, about who stepped where and why it ended when it did. Those debates missed the point. What mattered was not the exchange itself, but the reaction it left in its wake. The way certainty cracked without shattering. The way confidence shifted hands without being announced. Some left that room inspired, others unsettled, that stayed with people.